911, what's the address of the emergency?
It's the Orthopedic Hospital of Wisconsin on Gulf Road.
Okay, hang on just a moment. Okay, is that the Orthopedic Associates of Wisconsin?
Yep, it's behind it. It's in the vacant lot next to it.
Okay, what's the telephone number that you're calling me from? And your name, sir?
Nick Fricano.
Okay.
Indoor Construction.
And tell me exactly what happened?
We found a dead body in the woods when we were putting up stakes for no trespassing signs.
Okay. And where exactly are you in relation to the Orthopedic Associates? We're behind it, you said?
Yeah, we're to the west and behind it, like between the golf course and that. If you want to have someone meet me up.
Are you to the west or are you to the east?
Or no,
sir?
Sorry, to the east. Yes,
okay.
To the east.
Okay.
Yeah, to the east of the hospital. I'm standing in the parking lot of the hospital. We can walk back there.
Okay, and you're from a construction company?
Yep, yeah, we were putting up signs for Pro Healthcare on their lot, and we smelled something and then saw there's that guy back there. He's for a long time, so it ain't, he ain't coming back from it, so.
Okay. All right. What kind of vehicle are you going to be in so I can let them know?
I'm not in a vehicle. I'm in a red shirt with a white hard hat on.
Red shirt, white hard hat. Okay. Are you able to keep everybody away from it?
Yep, I got everybody out of there once we figured out what it is.
Okay. All right. I'll have a couple officers meet with you, okay?
All right.
All right. Bye-bye.
Yep. Bye.
Stephanie Pavlons was 44 years old when her life came to a tragic and mysterious end. But her story starts long before that day in August 2022. Stay tuned as we uncover the complex life she led, her struggles, her hopes, and the turbulence that surrounded her every day. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button. It helps the channel continue bringing these stories to light. Stephanie had always been a deeply private person, someone who documented her life in quiet detail. Her journals, filled with daily notes and sketches, offered glimpses into both her joys and her struggles. She battled depression, occasionally struggled with self-harm, and had faced suicide attempts in her past. Her family worried about her, especially her mother, Georgianne Pavlons, who often described Stephanie as gentle, but fragile. Despite these challenges, Stephanie was also a devoted mother. She shared at least one child with Mathew Pahl, her long-term partner. Friends and family remember her as loving, caring, and protective, someone who did everything she could for her child even as her own world felt unstable. Stephanie's life at home was far from peaceful. Her relationship with Mathew Pahl had stretched over 2 decades, marked by cycles of affection and conflict. Those closest to her described the relationship as turbulent, often laced with emotional and physical abuse. Her journals detailed moments of fear and pain, where each line traced the aftermath of another argument, or another episode of violence. One entry from July 2021 read, "Another depressing and physically abusing day. I think he likes to do it even though he says he doesn't hate my life." The next day, she wrote about a visible injury. "Got hit hard, left a nice mark on my chest, got a nice scar along with it." Images from her phone confirmed what the words described. A swollen eye, a red mark across her chest, the signs of a relationship that had long crossed the line from tension into harm. Yet even amid the abuse, Stephanie's daily life retained moments of normalcy. She prepared meals for her child, helped with homework, and tried to carve out small spaces of joy. These moments contrasted sharply with the darker aspects of her home life, creating a constant tension that she carried alone. Stephanie lived with Mathew in a modest apartment at Willow Park Apartments. Legally, she wasn't on the lease, a detail that underscored her vulnerability. Guests were allowed for only a limited number of days, and anyone staying longer required official permission. In practice, she lived there for extended periods, dependent on Mathew not just emotionally, but materially. This dependency added another layer to the control Mathew exerted. Stephanie's world was largely defined by his rules, his moods, and the invisible barriers he placed around her life. Every decision, from where she went to how she spent her day, had to be navigated carefully. Still, she had hope. She dreamt of stability, of safety, of a life where her child could grow up without fear. but those dreams were constantly shadowed by the reality of her relationship. Her journals, carefully preserved, became a record of both suffering and resilience. Her entries didn't just describe bruises. They described fear, isolation, and attempts to maintain some control over her life. Stephanie wrote about moments of happiness but paired them with sharp reminders of the instability around her. The contrast was stark: a life full of love for her child, yet overshadowed by a partner who could swing between tenderness and abuse. Her mother, Georgianne, noticed the signs long before the tragedy. She spoke of her daughter's struggles with mental health, epilepsy, and the medications she took daily. Each seizure, each bout of depression, added layers of concern. Georgianne often worried that Stephanie's fragile health and her emotional dependence on Mathew made her an easy target for control and manipulation. Stephanie's journal entries, paired with photographs, were a silent cry for help. They captured the fear, the physical pain, and the emotional exhaustion of a woman trying to navigate a life defined by someone else's control. Each page reflected a mind trying to make sense of love that had turned toxic. Even in the midst of the turmoil, Stephanie's role as a mother never wavered. She prioritized her child's safety and happiness, often at the expense of her own well-being. Friends and family noted that her love was fierce, protective, and unwavering, a stark contrast to the fears she felt in her own home. Living under Mathew's roof, Stephanie's movements were carefully watched. Surveillance cameras dotted the complex, not unusual for an apartment community, but they symbolized the scrutiny she lived under daily. Her life was both private and surveilled, a paradox that mirrored the complexity of her relationship. Stephanie Pavlons' life before her disappearance was a balancing act. Between love and fear, care and control, hope and despair, she navigated a reality few could fully understand. The journal entries, photographs, and the memories of those who knew her paint a vivid portrait of a woman resilient in the face of constant challenge. Her story is not just about the darkness she endured, but also about the humanity she maintained. A loving mother, a daughter, and a woman whose life, though fraught with difficulties, held a depth of emotion and courage. Stephanie's world was complicated, marked by love, abuse, and unspoken fears. Understanding her life before her disappearance is crucial to grasping the full story of what happened next. Stay with us, because in the next part, we'll explore the day her life took a tragic turn, the morning she was last seen alive, and the chilling trail of evidence that followed. August 23, 2022, started like any other day, ordinary, calm, and seemingly unremarkable. But by the end of it, Stephanie Pavlons would vanish, leaving behind questions that would haunt her family, friends, and the investigators who would follow her trail. That morning, Stephanie was captured on camera leaving her apartment and entering Mathew Pahl's truck. The footage shows her carrying personal belongings, a water bottle and a purse she would never return home with. For most, it would have appeared routine. But for investigators, every detail mattered. 8:39 a.m., the exact moment she gets into the truck. Small, mundane actions suddenly became critical pieces of a timeline that would later form the backbone of a criminal investigation. Shortly after leaving the store, mobile phone data placed both Stephanie and Mathew near the Orthopedic Associates Clinic, where Pahl had an appointment that morning. Forensics would later note this as a key moment: two people, moving together, heading toward a location that would become central to the investigation. Pahl arrived at the clinic around 9:15 a.m., but did not check in until 9:34 a.m. A gap of 16 minutes, unexplained, and one that investigators would examine closely. In that short window, the ordinary and the sinister collided. That 16-minute gap would become a focal point in building the timeline. Surveillance, digital data, and witness accounts could not directly show what happened, but they suggested that something out of the ordinary occurred during that time. Later that morning, surveillance cameras captured Pahl returning to the apartment alone. In his hands, the same pink water bottle Stephanie had carried. Shortly afterward, he was seen carrying a plastic shopping bag containing her black purse. Stephanie, however, was nowhere to be seen. Not a single frame of her returning, walking through the complex, or entering the apartment. For the first time, A chilling realization began to take hold: she hadn't come back. This absence of visual confirmation became the first real tension point in her disappearance. Investigators noted the pattern. Stephanie leaves, Mathew returns alone, her belongings follow, but she does not. Stephanie's phone continued to ping for several hours, but the movement suggested no return to her home. Investigators pieced together her digital footprint, timestamps, locations, and patterns that hinted at what had happened, even when no human eye had witnessed it. Her belongings became a haunting symbol of her absence. Every object carried a story, a memory, and a piece of evidence. The water bottle and purse, seen that morning, would later become central in building the narrative that she had never returned home alive. Investigators focused on these movements. The timeline was clear. Stephanie leaves her apartment at 8:39 a.m., enters the truck, heads to the clinic, and is never seen alive again. Paul returns alone shortly after 11 a.m., carrying her items. No witnesses, no confirmed sightings. Just empty space where she should have been. This absence raised questions. Where had she gone? How did she disappear without a trace? Every frame, every ping, every item left behind became evidence in a case that would rely heavily on circumstantial details. The investigators would later recover all of Stephanie's belongings from Paul's apartment: her phone, wallet, credit cards, and prescription bottles. But on that day, the first signs of her absence were subtle: a bag left in a truck, a water bottle on the counter, and a missing woman whose routine had been disrupted in an ordinary way. By reconstructing this timeline, investigators could see the pattern emerging. Each timestamp told a story: Stephanie's last confirmed sighting, her digital trail, the unexplained gaps, and the solitary return of Paul with her belongings. For the first time, her absence was undeniable. She hadn't returned home. She hadn't called or messaged anyone. Every ordinary morning ritual, breakfast, tidying up, interacting with her child, went unfulfilled. For those who knew her, it was unthinkable. Stephanie had been careful, thoughtful, and meticulous. Her disappearance wasn't the result of wandering off, as some later speculated. Her habits, documented in her journals and through daily routines, suggested she would not vanish without cause. The journal, a record of her life, would later serve as a haunting reminder of who she was and the normalcy that had been shattered that morning. It captured her plans, her intentions, and the small details that became critical in understanding the day she disappeared. August 23rd was the day her story shifted from routine to mystery. Every surveillance clip, every phone ping, every physical object left behind became part of a puzzle that investigators would have to solve without a clear confession or direct evidence. The first visual clues of her disappearance were subtle yet powerful: a water bottle, a purse, and the undeniable fact that Stephanie Pavlons had not returned home that morning. The ordinary had become ominous. By the end of that morning, Stephanie's absence was unmistakable. She had left with Mathew Pahl, her belongings had returned alone, and a chilling mystery had begun. What happened in those critical hours? The next part of our series will explore the investigation, the digital footprints, and the evidence that slowly pieced together the story of her disappearance. Stay with us, the timeline is just the beginning. September 9th, 2022, started like any other fall morning, but that day would mark the chilling discovery of Stephanie Pavlons' body. Her disappearance, which had already unsettled her friends and family, suddenly became a grim reality. Stay tuned as we uncover how investigators pieced together the events leading to her death, and the evidence that would form a circumstantial case against Mathew Pahl. Construction workers had stumbled across something that made their stomachs turn: human remains, badly decomposed, hidden in the woods north of Gulf Road, near the Orthopedic Associates Clinic. The level of decomposition made immediate identification impossible, and the medical examiner could not determine the cause or manner of death at first glance. Investigators relied on dental records, tattoos, jewelry, and a medical pin to confirm the victim's identity. Stephanie Pavlons, 44 years old, was finally identified. Her family, already fearful since her disappearance, were struck with both grief and disbelief. Soon after, Mathew Pahl was taken in for questioning. His story was consistent with the version he had offered from the start. Stephanie had been unpredictable, he claimed. She often threatened suicide. She sometimes wandered into the woods alone. In his account, her disappearance was tragic but not criminal. But investigators were not convinced. Stephanie's journals told a different story, one of years of abuse, fear, and control. Entries described physical injuries, emotional exhaustion, and repeated conflicts with Paul. Photos from previous years documented visible marks, bruised eyes, red chest marks, scars. A search of Paul's apartment revealed more pieces of the puzzle. Stephanie's phone, wallet, prescription bottles, and personal effects were found in his residence. These items were supposed to belong to someone who had disappeared, a clue that tied Paul directly to her absence. Digital forensics showed that Paul had deleted nearly 1,000 messages from his phone. Investigators noted that this suggested a deliberate attempt to remove evidence, or at the very least, obscured his communication history during the critical period after Stephanie vanished. His digital footprint revealed more than simple deletions. Between August 26 and September 17, he conducted multiple obituary searches for Pavlons, just days after Stephanie's disappearance, and weeks before her body was publicly identified. He also frequently accessed a police scanner app, monitoring activity in the town, including on the day her remains were discovered. Further investigation uncovered Skype accounts Paul used to communicate with women in the Philippines. Conversations indicated personal desires and plans to move abroad, a secretive behavior that investigators would later argue reflected a pattern of hiding intentions and maintaining dual lives. One piece of evidence stood out: K9 Raven, a trained cadaver dog, alerted to Paul's vehicle, suggesting it had once carried human remains. While not definitive on its own, the alert added weight to the possibility that he had transported or concealed Stephanie's body. Experts estimated the time of death using entomology. The insect activity suggested Stephanie had died around August 23 to 26, 2022, aligning closely with the last time she had been seen. The timing supported the theory that she died soon after leaving with Paul, reinforcing the circumstantial narrative. Investigators faced a challenge. The medical examiner could not determine a definitive cause of death. There were no fractures, no visible trauma beyond the autopsy's sharp force dissection marks, and no DNA tying Paul directly to the act of killing. The case would have to rely on circumstantial evidence, digital traces, surveillance, physical items, and behavioral patterns. Stephanie's belongings, the pink water bottle, the black purse, her phone, and medications, became central to the investigation. Their presence in Paul's apartment suggested that she had not simply left or wandered off. Every item told a story of control, possession, and disappearance. Footage from Willow Park Apartments showed Paul carrying her water bottle and then her purse, returning alone to his apartment. Stephanie, however, was absent. The recordings provided the first visual evidence that corroborated the physical and digital evidence pointing to her disappearance. By combining surveillance, phone pings, deleted messages, and digital searches, investigators reconstructed the timeline. Each piece fit together like fragments of a puzzle: Stephanie leaving with Paul, never returning, Paul's isolated return, and digital traces showing unusual activity and obfuscation. The journals added another layer, not just narrative, but motive. Entries documented repeated physical abuse and emotional distress. Investigators used these records to show a pattern of control and intimidation, providing context for why Stephanie's disappearance could involve foul play. Every object recovered, every deletion on his phone, and every digital search painted a picture. Even without a definitive cause of death, investigators were beginning to see a coherent story. Someone, likely Paul, had a hand in her disappearance and the circumstances surrounding her death. Building a case without a clear cause of death required meticulous attention to detail. Digital activity had to be documented, physical evidence carefully logged, and each behavioral clue analyzed. The absence of a direct confession or forensic smoking gun meant the story had to be told through patterns, timing, and circumstantial connections. From the moment Stephanie's remains were found, investigators had to rely on indirect evidence. Phone data, deleted messages, surveillance footage, journal entries, and personal items became the backbone of the case. Every anomaly, every gap, every signal from the past was examined for what it could reveal about her final hours. Her journals, once private reflections of fear and struggle, became evidence. They connected past abuse to her disappearance and provided insight into the vulnerability she faced daily. Investigators could now see a pattern, one that pointed to a narrative of control, confrontation, and ultimately, disappearance. The challenge was immense. No cause of death. No witnesses. No confession. But each piece of evidence, physical, digital, and behavioral, added weight to a growing circumstantial case. For investigators, every clue brought them one step closer to understanding what happened to Stephanie Pavlons. By September 2022, the pieces of Stephanie's life, her disappearance, and the traces left behind were coming together. The body in the woods, the digital trail, the journals, and her belongings all pointed toward a story that would eventually reach the courtroom. In the next part of the series, we'll explore the trial itself, the confrontation of evidence, the arguments from both sides, and the verdict that finally brought justice. October 27, 2025, marked the beginning of a trial that had been years in the making. Stephanie Pavlons' disappearance, the discovery of her body, and the web of evidence pointing toward Mathew Pahl would finally be laid bare in a courtroom. Every surveillance clip, journal entry, and digital trace would be scrutinized. The stakes were clear: the story of her last day, and the months that followed, would determine justice for Stephanie. The prosecution opened their case with a compelling narrative. Stephanie and Pahl had a long-term, turbulent relationship, marked by abuse and control. They presented her journals and photos, highlighting injuries and emotional distress. Surveillance footage was shown, displaying the day she disappeared, getting into Pahl's truck, carrying her pink water bottle and black purse, and later, the footage of Pahl returning alone to the apartment with her belongings. Stephanie's journals became a central piece of the narrative. Entries described daily abuse, visible scars, and the fears she lived with. The prosecution argued that these writings were not just reflections of her past, but the context for a fatal confrontation on August 23, 2022, the day she was last seen alive. Digital evidence painted a timeline of Pahl's movements and behavior. Investigators highlighted his deleted messages, searches for Pavlons in local obituaries starting just days after her disappearance, and frequent use of a police scanner app. These actions, the prosecution argued, indicated more than concern. They were signs of a man attempting to cover his tracks. Experts testified on forensic evidence. K9 Raven had alerted to Pahl's vehicle, suggesting human remains had been present. A forensic entomologist estimated Stephanie's date of death around August 23 to 26, aligning with when she was last seen. Even without a definitive cause of death, the timing and sequence of events formed a pattern consistent with the prosecution's theory. The prosecution framed a story of control, confrontation, and disappearance, a narrative compelling enough that it didn't rely on a single smoking gun. Each piece of evidence, while circumstantial, connected, forming a timeline that placed Pahl at the center of Stephanie's final hours. The defense countered with a focus on uncertainty. They emphasized the lack of a definitive cause of death. Stephanie had medical conditions, including epilepsy, and had a history of depression. Could she have died due to a medical event or other natural cause? The prosecution's theory, the defense argued, was speculative. They also highlighted Pahl's physical condition, a broken foot in a medical boot. The defense suggested it made it implausible for him to physically carry a body into the woods near the clinic. The reliability of the cadaver dog was questioned. Could an alert definitively prove that human remains were in the vehicle at a specific time, or was it merely suggestive? The defense used this argument to introduce doubt about the prosecution's narrative. Regarding deleted messages, the defense argued that erasing texts was not evidence of guilt. People delete messages for countless reasons, they contended: privacy, routine, or digital organization. Despite the defense's arguments, the prosecution maintained that the combination of surveillance, digital footprints, recovered personal items, and a documented history of abuse created a compelling circumstantial case. Every gap in Pahl's story, every unaccounted for minute on August 23, strengthened the narrative that he had caused Stephanie's death. The jury deliberated for about an hour. Fast, decisive, and reflective of how strongly the evidence resonated. They had to weigh circumstantial evidence, expert testimony, and digital records against the defense's assertions of doubt. On November 4, 2025, the verdict was announced. Mathew Pahl was found guilty of first-degree intentional homicide and hiding a corpse. The room, filled with family members and observers, held a tense silence before relief and emotion washed over those who had waited for years for justice. A week later, on November 11, Pahl was sentenced. Life in prison without eligibility for extended supervision for the homicide charge. An additional 12.5 years for hiding a corpse, with 7.5 years in initial confinement and 5 years of extended supervision, to run consecutively. He was also ordered to pay restitution for funeral costs. For Stephanie's family, the verdict brought a complex mix of grief and relief. The years of uncertainty, the haunting absence of answers, were finally met with recognition that justice had been served. Her mother reflected on the pain and patterns of abuse that had defined Stephanie's relationship with Pahl, grateful that the truth had come to light. During sentencing, Pahl maintained his innocence. He told the court, "I am the only victim here." His words, in stark contrast to the years of documented abuse and the loss of Stephanie's life, highlighted the disconnect between his perception and the reality the jury had accepted. Stephanie's story, her struggles, and her life became central to the trial's narrative. While Pahl attempted to cast himself as a victim, the evidence told a different story, one of control, abuse, and ultimately, a fatal act. The jury's decision reflected the weight of this evidence, even in the absence of a direct confession or clear forensic cause of death. For those left behind, the conviction was more than a legal victory. It was closure, recognition, and an affirmation that Stephanie's life mattered, that her story would not be forgotten, and that her struggles with domestic abuse would inform others about the realities many face behind closed doors. The trial, verdict, and sentencing illustrated the challenges of pursuing justice in cases dominated by circumstantial evidence. Surveillance footage, digital behavior, journals, and personal items, seemingly small details, can collectively form a powerful narrative, even without a single, undeniable moment of physical proof. Stephanie Pavlons' story ends with accountability, but her life continues to resonate, a reminder of the dangers of domestic abuse and the perseverance required to uncover the truth. Mathew Pahl's conviction may have provided justice, but it also serves as a cautionary tale. Evidence can speak loudly, even when silence and absence seem to dominate. If you want to follow more stories like Stephanie's and uncover the details of cases that shape communities, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Each case reminds us that the truth is out there, waiting to be discovered.